Gatekeeping, as in the unlawful denial of housing to vulnerable people, happens across the whole of England and basically does untold damage. But the question is, how does it happen? How is it that so many people know about this and yet nothing really changes? It's become acceptable for housing officers to knowingly or recklessly break the law. And often the argument is, there's no housing. But obviously gatekeeping, by hiding the scale of the issue, has played a big part in there not being enough housing in the first place. So in this video, I'm going to try and explain a few kind of things which might have a bearing on this situation. Some of it's not very controversial in the sense that I think most people would agree with it. Some of it's a little bit more speculative when I look at the psychology of gatekeeping, drawing on a few kind of famous experiments and a few other bits and pieces to try and understand why this happens. And I guess the point of it is obviously to try and fight it. It's not about kind of shaming housing officers. I guess I'll say right off the bat, I've been in the homelessness sector for 20 years, worked in the homelessness sector for 20 years. And I look back at my first years working in a night shelter and I wince at just how ridiculous some of my practice was. I remember barring very vulnerable people in the middle of the night for basically breaking very minor rules, because that's what the rules were. And I'm just doing my job. That was kind of my explanation. Luckily, I kind of had a lot of good people around me who kind of showed me the error of my ways over time. And by the time I then worked in Bedford Borough Council in the housing team and saw the sorts of things that were happening, fortunately I didn't kind of collude with it, end up whistleblowing there, set up a little charity called Just Us with my friend John Allen, and have seen an increase in temporary accommodation for single homeless people in the region of about 5,000%. So I guess what I'd also just kind of make this point at the start is that for housing officers out there who get annoyed with me saying this sort of stuff, there is an option. You do have agency. There are options out there in terms of what you can do about it. In my opinion, it's simply not okay just to basically shrug and say that's just the way it is, because what we're essentially doing is we're selling off the rights of the civil rights of very vulnerable people, and that's simply not our place to do that. So as I say, some of the stuff I'm going to go through pretty uncontroversial. I think most people will agree, but might still be interesting. And then, as I say, finish off with some more speculative stuff. So I guess the first thing I'd say is that housing law genuinely is quite complicated, particularly around definitions of suitability and of priority needs. And what you find is that the officers making these decisions are under lots of different pressures to break the law. When I worked in Bedford Borough Council, for example, one of the team leaders would essentially instruct his officers to gatekeep people using whichever test got rid of them first. That was his words, just use the test that got rid of them first. And again, there's kind of lots of other stuff kind of having a bearing on housing officers which were not so explicit but still had that impact. But yeah, basically bottom line is housing law is genuinely complicated. So that brings us to the next point, that the law itself is very onerous on councils, and the law itself is, in various judgments over the years, have made this point. So for example, there's a massive case in 2015 known as HOTAC. There's actually kind of 3 cases rolled into one, and in that case the Supreme Court made the point that the threshold of vulnerability is supposed to be an objective test. It is never about whether the council has enough resources to fulfil its needs. And it makes the point that when the law was initially brought in 1996, that was Parliament's intention, that it was supposed to be onerous. It's supposed to be about making sure that people who are actually vulnerable are never left without help and left onto the streets. And so when you see people on the high street, on your local high street, whatever, they might be homeless, kind of begging or whatever, the chances are that there has been a whole string of professionals who have essentially kind of not helped them out because they felt there wasn't enough resources. But the reality is that the injustices that those individuals have suffered has a bearing on how they then react with the rest of the world, and so it can explain quite a lot in terms of kind of unconstructive behaviours you might see associated with it. So yeah, just bear that in mind when you see kind of people who are rough sleeping or people who are homeless in general getting criticism. Just bear in mind that probably multiple professionals who get paid relatively good money, good benefits certainly, have essentially denied them housing when there was a duty to provide that housing for them. So it's absolutely onerous. There's a big case, I can't remember now, year or 18 months ago with Croydon, and effectively Croydon had a situation where they had someone in temporary accommodation. It wasn't suitable. They accepted it was not suitable, but they said, look, we've got nowhere else. And it went to, I think it was a Supreme Court again, actually. I might be wrong about that. It might be a Court of Appeal. But effectively, the judge said, you've got a duty to do it, get to it. There's no kind of option really with that. So yeah, that's the kind of expectation on councils, and there are some councils like Croydon, like Birmingham, like Nottingham, who are pretty much bankrupt, and so it's probably less realistic for them to get themselves out of the mess they've got themselves into. But most councils are not like that. They might all say, we haven't got enough money, but they do if they put their mind to it. As I say, in Bedford, they've invested tens of millions of pounds in temporary accommodation, in new housing officer positions, apparently, it's been said in the Housing Committee on the back of the complaints and the compensation we made over the last 10 years. So, as I say, it just goes back to this point. We do have agency. If you're in a job where you're being told to break the law or you're required to break the law, you do have a choice. In fact, you've got several choices, which I'll kind of come to at the end of the video. So yeah, so the law is onerous for sure. And at the moment there hasn't been this kind of real kind of response to it that's going to fix it. In this kind of sense, I would compare this to COVID and the whole kind of furlough scheme, because if you think how radical that furlough scheme was and how quickly it was put together and how much it cost, what it showed to me was that the government can fix things if they understand the importance of it. And I would say that the housing crisis probably has a similar, a similar kind of level of impact on the country's health, in terms of, just how many hundreds of thousands of people are without safe housing, which means they, if nothing else, if you look at it cynically, they can't pay tax, or they can't pay as much tax. So that's kind of idea of, the damage that the housing crisis has done over decades, I would say is on the same magnitude or same kind of scale of magnitude as COVID in terms of its implications. The difference is that COVID was very much in the face, particularly in the face of those politicians. So, COVID could affect anyone and did affect, Boris in intensive care or whatever. Whereas homelessness does not affect everyone. You kind of hear charities say, homelessness could affect anyone. No, it can't. It can really only affect those people who don't have the kind of safety net that privileged people would have. So it's not something that really any politician is at risk of. Whereas, COVID was. I guess that's the point I'm making. So yeah, so you've got this idea that the law is onerous, but for me, that's it's something which is entirely fixable if the government put its mind to it, if it kind of held it in that high regard. And I guess there's that kind of analogy of a frog boiling. Apparently you can boil a frog. If you throw a frog into boiling water, it'll jump out. But if you boil it slowly, it doesn't get out. And I think that's kind of what we've seen with the housing crisis. And the fact it's just been such a slow burning issue has meant that we've got thousands of professionals who just kind of see it as the way things are, rather than seeing it as an urgent case of something that should never happen. So yeah, it's onerous for sure. And it's cheaper to gatekeep. So even if you get your complaint through to the local government and social care ombudsman, the amount of money the council will have to pay you is less than what they'd have to pay if they actually followed the law in the first place. And that means that Machiavellian council officers kind of know that, if they break the law, it's highly unlikely they'll get caught. And even if they do caught, so what? A few £100 compensation payout, at most a few £1,000s. In very exceptional cases, tens of thousands of pounds, but that is very exceptional indeed. You don't sort of see that very often. And so I think that's kind of what a lot of councils, they kind of see it. They think, well, actually there's not really any punishment for us breaking the law. Very little chance of us getting caught, so we're just going to keep doing it. And I can think of particularly kind of roguish housing officers that I've seen over the years. I remember one guy, he came into the Bedford Borough Council. I immediately have a complaint about a guy just coming out of a psychiatric unit and how he was told he was not in priority need. Raised it to the head of service, and I thought that the head of service was kind of taking it serious at the time. Anyway, next week I find out that this guy's been promoted. He's now team leader, and I would say the council then came to regret that because of the amount of ridiculous things he did, and they did get caught for a few things. So that's kind of something which means that actually there's something about the structure of housing teams that it's not that every officer's a bad person, but there are a few bad people in there. I'll talk more about that later. And effectively it seems that they're the ones who tend to be promoted in one sense, because they're the ones that save the housing team's budget the most money. They're the ones who get promoted up the ladder more easily. I'm not saying, again, I'm just talking in general terms. But that's a phenomenon I think you see. And so you kind of, certainly my experience of Bedford was, the overriding culture was horrible, but more than half of the officers were decent people. But yet this kind of domineering kind of culture was the one which kind of was certainly the one which was overtly was seen. And so actually some of the good housing officers would literally basically house people without their manager knowing about it. Wait till the manager's off for a week and just kind of house a few people and try and get away with it, that sort of thing. So there are some real heroes in those housing teams, which I'll talk about a little bit later as well. So yeah, let me just kind of do the uncontroversial stuff first. So similarly, there's no kind of professional body that housing officers are signed up to, so it's not like social work. I've said elsewhere, I don't know of any situation in the country where there is a greater power imbalance as there is between a homeless person and a housing officer. So you might argue that social workers have a lot of power. They can remove children from their parents' care in theory. But to do that, they've got to go through some really rigorous and robust kind of mechanisms that are going to prevent that happening when it shouldn't. Or I'm sure there are still cases, but it's, you've got to go through a judge basically to do that. Whereas a housing officer can very easily deny someone housing without even kind of writing a letter. They could just literally tell someone, oh, you're not in priority need, there's no point making a homeless application, off you go. So I think, if you were really wanting to get angry about something, the sorts of things that happen in those private interview rooms would make anyone's blood boil. And the sad fact is, the more vulnerable you are, the easier it is to gatekeep you, because you're going to have less ability to kind of navigate the system, understand the law, all that sort of thing if you're rough sleeping, than it would be if you're kind of a middle class Karen who stamps her feet and cries and gets the councillor and the MP involved, that sort of thing. So I think that's kind of something which, if you look at the amount of injustice that happens through this kind of process of gatekeeping, the worst thing I'd say out of all of it is the fact that it's the vulnerability of those people that it actually happens to. So and I'm sure if you've been homeless, you may well have experienced something similar. So there's no professional body, there's no qualification required for housing officers. Often they'll just kind of end up in a housing team as a kind of sideways move from another department in the council. And there's very little training. So earlier this year, this is 2024, we did FOIs for about 15 councils. And I'll do a separate video about them actually, because it was interesting kind of the differences. But at best, councils would get training from Shelter, which is a good sign. Shelter know their stuff, and I'm sure that training is robust. Some big councils would get training from an internal manager. So all their training would literally be done by a manager, which might be cheaper, but that relies on that manager actually knowing what they're doing. And in that particular council's case, I know the manager a little bit, and I would not struggle to believe he's telling his staff things that aren't actually lawful. And as when you kind of do the sort of casework that I've done over the years, you'll see that housing officers often don't know even the basic stuff about what they're doing. They're kind of using template letters and so on. I'll talk about that in a minute. But they're kind of really kind of lost at sea, and yet their default is always to I haven't seen many people getting housed when they shouldn't have been housed. I've seen one person I can remember, but I've seen hundreds of people not being housed when they should have been housed. So it's kind of clearly you can see that bias that is operating on housing officers, where they might not know the law very well. It just so happens that they always misuse it in a way that denies housing rather than actually gives it housing. And in terms of kind of a brief overview of the sorts of training they get, so as I say, some would get it from Shelter, some would get it from internal management, some would have no training at all. Most had no training at all on things like the Equality Act, the Care Act, mental capacity assessments. All of those things they need to get decent training on. Data protection is another one where they'd just be doing like a little online half-an-hour thing every year. Again, that's just not going to actually kind of mean that that officer isn't knowledgeable. And in my experience, housing officers are very rarely kind of curious about what the law actually is. So I can only think of one situation where I've kind of had a discussion with the housing officer, told them why they were wrong, and they actually went out and found out for themselves what the law was. In most cases, they'll just kind of shut down, and again, I'll talk about that. The agentic state is kind of called, where they just shut down and they just kind of back themselves into a corner, and then it just makes it quite difficult to get the situation resolved without complaining and getting it reviewed and stuff. So so there's some stuff around sort of training, which is almost all the council. Well, every council had deficiencies that we saw in terms of important areas of law. Again, I'll do a separate video I think about that. And then I've just mentioned templates. Don't ever think that your housing officer wrote those letters that they send to you. They're just templates, and the templates are often written in a way which just make it kind of direct housing officers to get rid of people and kind of not accept a duty. So I remember one of the ones I raised publicly in Bedford was for a guy who had very serious arthritis and PTSD. And effectively the opening paragraph of the decision letter kind of said, insert health issues here. So they inserted, PTSD and osteoarthritis, and the medication is on Oromorph and all sorts of things. And basically, kind of went through this thing. I've carefully considered whether or not you got a disability, and I've carefully concluded that you don't have a disability. And it was just laughable. And actually that, in one sense, was the thing which meant he was not getting housed at the time. We had to challenge it through the review process. So those kind of templates that you see might seem like the housing officer knows what they're doing. They don't understand what they're writing most of the time. They're really just kind of shoehorned into making these decisions in a way which just is never going to be a fair assessment. And it's why it's always worth challenging them, because it's generally not very difficult to start seeing where the cracks in these decisions are. So, and one example of this, it kind of became a bit infamous. Nearly Legal reported it a few years ago, so I'll link into it. But effectively, it was in Torbay Council, and this guy had been in temporary accommodation. I think he'd attempted suicide, gone into hospital, and because he wasn't occupying his temporary accommodation place because he was in hospital, he was then evicted and told he was intentionally homeless. And effectively, the template meant that the housing officer had written, what was the deliberate act? Well, you tried to kill yourself. Was it your own fault? Effectively, yes, because you disregarded the advice from mental health professionals. and widely got scorned, as it kind of became, as people became aware of it. It was reported in the local press there as well. But that sort of thing is a result of these unthinking housing officers without any training, certainly without any training around the importance of what they're doing and the importance of making decisions well, kind of just making these template decisions and all the ridiculous things that come from it. And a few more points on this sort of thing. So you've also got the fact that some councils structure their service so that if a housing officer accepts a duty, then they're the ones who have to go and find the accommodation. So that means they know if they accept someone's in priority need, or they might be in priority need at 9 o'clock in the morning, they know they're going to be staying until 7 o'clock at night to try and find hotel accommodation for that person, which again just kind of puts this implicit pressure on housing officers not to accept that kind of workload. And talking of workload, caseloads, again, I did a bunch of FOIs with some friends earlier this year, and on average housing officer caseloads had nearly doubled since the Homelessness Reduction Act came in. And that's important because the Homelessness Reduction Act put loads of additional onerous duties on housing officers. And we raised this in Bedford, kind of said, in Bedford it actually nearly tripled. And we basically said, how are housing officers supposed to do their job properly? And the housing committee, fair play to them, went away, and the council went away, and they employed another 22 housing officers, or 20 housing officers. So you can kind of see again how, that's clearly an issue. It's an issue which was worth raising, and it actually led to a good result. So yeah, and I guess finally I'd say in terms of the system, we've talked about councils. The other thing is charities. So charities generally will get funded by their local authority, and because of that they won't raise issues robustly. They might raise them kind of like, sort of whisper them, but they won't really ever kind of take on a council properly. And you might think that's outrageous, but bear in mind I've trained, I don't know, hundreds of organisations around the country. I have no idea how many organisations, but again and again, get to the end of the day's training, everyone's like buzzing, they're like, wow, this is amazing, we can go and get people housed really easily. And then the kind of rubber hits the road when, I remember one recently where there was a guy who's rough sleeping, and very clearly from what had happened was he was in priority need, and very clearly the council there had failed to recognise that. It would have been a really easy challenge. And the worker was like, this is amazing, I'm going to go and do this, Monday morning I'm going to go in there and kind of get it sorted. I got an email Monday morning, or Monday lunchtime, and basically saying that the manager had told them not to do it because they couldn't rock the boat. And that term, not rocking the boat, crops up a lot with the conversations I have with people. So again, it's not just councils at fault here in terms of not raising the issue, it's also charities. And you kind of see some of the myths that are out there around local connection and intentional homelessness perpetuated on big charities websites. So I remember 10 years ago with Crisis, I'll put a screenshot up on the screen actually, you can kind of work out yourself how unlawful it is. But basically, this one paragraph had about 5 different errors, and I contacted Crisis and they took it down. But that again is something which, charities themselves, they kind of might make a big scene of how great they are and how they're kind of working tirelessly to end homelessness. But the reality is that they're missing very easy ways to end homelessness in reality. Again, I would say Just Us, which I set up in Bedford with John Allen, who still works there. That's for me is a good model. I'm not saying it's the only model that works, but it's a really good model for a very small number of people, getting hundreds and hundreds of people housed who they've never met before. So there's some structural things which I think are generally less controversial. The bits about charities you might argue with, but I'm happy kind of having that argument. And I guess, I'm talking about this in 2024, we've got the post office scandal going on, we've got numerous other scandals going on, and again and again and again you see the same kinds of issues happening. Everyone knows about it, everyone should really see that something is really bad that's happening, and yet very few people actually do anything about it. So again, when I watched the post office inquiry around the post office investigation team, for example, some of those staff members, I could kind of, very easily kind of think of housing officers who they reminded me of. And again, so this question of, how do housing officers get up in the morning, get into work, and know that they're about to break the law? At some level, they might not kind of be thinking about it really kind of in the front of their mind, but they must surely know that some of the stuff they're doing at least is just not okay. And why do they keep doing it? And there's a number of reasons why it might be, and again, this is all speculative. The first thing I guess I'll just get out of the way is that there are some sadists working in housing officer roles. I've got no doubt about that. I'm about as certain of that as I am of anything. It's very difficult to prove, but I can certainly remember particular officers who I've gone into a council with, client, and just the way they were treated was just, they were literally just poking and trying to get them to react in a way which would make, would basically mean that the person would erupt and kind of storm off and leave, and kind of worked kind of through some of that stuff with clients who that happened to. But yeah, I would say that certainly there are issues of sadism within that. There are issues of racism within that, and kind of other sort of discrimination going on, both protected characteristics and unprotected characteristics, like things like offending histories and use of drugs and alcohol, that sort of thing, which again aren't legal. So I don't really care what the housing officer thinks in their own time, but when they're in work time, their job is to discharge the council's duties legally, and it's not okay just to dismiss let's say substance use as a lifestyle choice. That's one of many issues that you see. So you have a few sadists, but that's by far they're not the ones who do the most harm. You've then got the really good housing officers, the ones who basically do the absolute best they can to help as many people as they can, knowing that if they help too many people, they'll get sacked. That's the reality of it, yeah. And again, I've got examples of that within Bedford, actually very kind of concrete examples of where someone has gone too far, a housing officer's gone too far arguing with their boss to say that their duty is owed to someone, and 2 weeks later their contract gets ended. Again, I'm thinking of one particular case there, which I actually have written evidence from the council that that's basically what happened. So yeah, you have the really good housing officers who basically they kind of do the most good they can do in the circumstance. And the thing is, they know if they quit, someone who replaces them is likely to not be as good as them. So that's kind of their reality, is they're doing the best they can do, knowing that they're kind of trapped in that situation, and they want the best for the client group, so they're kind of sticking in that role. But as they do that, they know that they're getting things wrong. They're breaking the law in some ways. And I've got every respect for those people. Now, I would say the only thing I'd say to people in that situation is, by taking that stance, they don't change anything. The system doesn't change, and the system needs to change. That's the thing. In Bedford, I knew a couple of us actually kind of putting their head above the parapet had immeasurable benefits to the town and to the people who are homeless there. I would say every area needs to have some kind of organisation kind of rattling the cage of the council when they're breaking the law. Without that, you kind of just have this situation where the system doesn't change and everyone kind of thinks it's someone else's job. So that's kind of, as I say, I've got every respect for people like that, for housing officers like that. But I'd say, how long are you going to do this? You're going to do this for 2 decades until the end of your career, and the end of your career, how many people do you think you would have unlawfully denied housing to? I'd imagine that you're looking at hundreds, probably, if not thousands, over the years. So that's one response that staff members have, that housing officers have. Another one is just to quit, and I'd say, do you know what? That's actually a completely understandable and rational thing to do. You're in a team. It's very, very, I would say personally it's impossible to change a team from within. I see a lot of people say that I'm going to go and change the team from within, and it doesn't happen. I speak to them 6 months later and they're just really burnt out and really kind of disappointed, because I would say it's almost impossible to achieve that. I would say you need people from the outside of the council exposing these issues. You can't do it from within, because you're just going to get sacked if nothing else. And so you've got those people who quit, which I think is a entirely defensible position. You also have those who whistleblow, and again, I've had a conversation with a few people like that. I've got to know someone quite well who's actually done it in multiple councils before. But again, whistleblowing in itself doesn't really change anything. That was my experience at Bedford anyway. So I whistleblew. It was basically, for all intents and purposes, upheld. They don't say it's upheld, but basically I know there was some disciplinary action that took on with the staff, and I know that some other stuff happened as a result of it. But that in itself didn't change anything. It took 2 or 3 years of consistently challenging the council, complaining about stuff, getting compensation before things started to move at all. And as I say, 10 years on, we're now getting kind of, said in the council housing committee publicly that it was on the back of the complaints that we made and the kind of compensation we got for people, which is why the council started to try and follow the law. So just to labour the point again, it can be done. So that's kind of those kind of categories of housing officers, in my opinion, from my perspective. You've then got the ones which do the most harm by far, but they're actually interesting because they're not sadists. They're not trying to hurt anyone. They're just kind of unthinkingly just doing their jobs, following the rules, following orders, that sort of thing. And I would say the majority of housing officers fit into that category, in my experience. Again, limited experience. I've been within 3 council teams before, 3 different councils, so again, I'm kind of just piecing some stuff together, but I think it's probably true of a lot more councils from what I hear. Bearing in mind in the training, I kind of hear every time I do training around different things which are happening in local councils, and it's basically all following the same kinds of patterns of behaviour. So you've got these ones who, effectively they don't enjoy gatekeeping. They don't get up in the morning thinking, I can go and gatekeep today. They do it begrudgingly, but the thing is that because they've kind of swallowed this statement that there is nothing that anyone can do, there isn't enough housing, because they've kind of accepted at some level those kinds of statements, everything they then do is kind of, is just kind of reinforces that position. There's not enough housing, therefore this is the only thing we can do, therefore I'm not culpable for what I'm doing. And I think for those people I have the biggest problem with. I've talked with multiple housing officers who feel like they're the victim. Generally, you talk to them, they're kind of like they're so outraged when I say some of the stuff I say. They're like, but this is the homeless people. They cause it on themselves. They bring it on themselves, and you don't know how hard it is to work in this situation. And I'm like, I have some idea at least. I can talk about my experience of whistleblowing at another time, but I have some idea of what that's like to be in a council team where you're being told to, or you're being pressured into breaking the law. But that's kind of it. It's just an interesting bit of psychology, and again, I want to just stay with this issue for a little bit. There's a few kind of, I don't know, like models or psychological models out there which might account for it, and I'm not an expert, but I'd say they have quite a lot of explanatory value, these kind of ideas. And I'll start with a guy called Stanley Milgram, who famously conducted the experiments around obedience to authority, and I won't bore you with the details. It's a fascinating experiment. There's a really good film about it with Peter Sarsgaard that's very faithful to the original kind of events. But in effect, what Milgram showed was that 70% of members of the public will knowingly, consciously deliver what they think is a fatal dose of electricity to another member of the public. So it was all kind of set up. It wasn't really happening, but they thought they were basically administering fatal electric shocks to people, all because there was a guy in a white coat who told them to. That's effectively what happened with the experiment, and that is kind of relevant within housing teams, because these days particularly, frontline housing officers often aren't the ones who make the decisions at all. They have to run everything through their boss. And so I've worked with housing officers on the front desk or whatever, and they kind of say, look, I think there's a duty to house this person, but I need to go and run it by my boss. And often they'll tell you at that point, can you get some more information to kind of make it more compelling, which I shouldn't have to do, but I'll do it if I can. And they'll go away and they'll come back looking sheepish and saying, do you know what, my manager's saying no. And they kind of, it's not, they're not the ones kind of instigating it, but they're having to kind of just follow the rules in this sense. And I'd say that, again, they're not enjoying doing that. They're probably losing sleep over it, to be honest, but they are doing it. They are agents. They are kind of, adults with capacity. They cannot just say, I'm just following orders. They have these other options, which include raising a grievance, raising it in supervision, whistleblowing, among a number of other things. And so you've got the Milgram experiments, and then Milgram went on to coin this term, the agentic state. And what he was basically saying there is that within bureaucracies, there's something about being in a bureaucracy which kind of shuts down your critical thinking. And so you go into a bureaucracy, you have an issue with them, they're kind of saying computer says no, that sort of thing. And they just double down. There's nothing you can say to them whilst they're in that state that would actually compel them to change their mind. As I say, I've seen it once out of hundreds of times. The issue was quite a minor one in that sense. This housing officer was trying to offer accommodation outside the district, and I said, okay, that's fine. The guy's got, the client's got no money to get there. You're going to have to arrange a taxi or public transport. And he initially had an argument. I said, no, really, this is the way it is. And he went away, came back and said, no, okay, fair enough. We'll arrange public transport. That's the only ever time I've seen a housing officer actually be reasonable. Most of the time you have to go to their boss, you have to escalate it to actually get the right outcome. And I think it's because you're psychologically, humans just aren't very good at this sort of stuff about critically thinking. They just shut off from that sort of rational kind of thinking, and end up doing a lot of harm as a result. So you've got the Milgram experiment. You've got someone called Hannah Arendt. I've got to be quite careful how I say this. So Hannah Arendt was an amazing, I guess, philosopher, a thinker, kind of essayist, that sort of thing. And she did a lot, her famous work is called The Banality of Evil. And in that book, she basically said that, as I say, kind of what I'm saying at the moment, really, I would take on board a lot of what she said in the different books. But basically, it's not that these housing officers are happy doing it. They just have this belief, they've accepted this belief that it's the only way and that there's nothing they can do about it. There's no alternative to it. And as a consequence, they cause incalculable harm. And so I think that's the kind of the key thing I'd say that needs to change, is that housing officers need to understand they do have agency. And when it comes to, this is where often discussions go when I'm talking to housing officers in this level of depth, which isn't very often, by the way. I'm not kind of having these conversations every week, but I've had maybe 5 or 6 over the last few years. And what it effectively gets to is, the housing officers say, look, I've got a mortgage to pay, I get paid well, or I get paid better here than I would in another job. If I worked in a charity or something, I take a £5 pay cut. It's got really good benefits. I simply cannot afford to rock the boat. And that's kind of, that seems to be an acceptable defence for breaking the law and leaving people homeless. And I would say, when we talk about homelessness being a lifestyle choice, increasingly I think it actually is. Homelessness that we see in today's society is a lifestyle choice. It's just not the lifestyle choice of the homeless people. It's the lifestyle choices of the charity chief execs, the housing officers who are doing the stuff, particularly the housing options managers, those kind of things. They all just basically feel trapped in this job. They know implicitly that if they rock the boat, there will be consequences, and there will be consequences, no doubt. But they just feel like that's that they're just trapped in this role, and they'll kind of do the best they can. But really the best they can is terrible, and it hurts a lot of people. So that's kind of something I kind of finished this video off with. Now, again, I'm not saying this just to kind of needlessly have a pop at housing officers, but personally, my belief is that gatekeeping is simply is just indefensible. And if only housing officers realised they had agency and could start to use it, I think we'd see across the country councils massively improve their services. I've only done it with one council, so I can only base it on that one experience. But it was really, really effective. It's hard work, for sure. I mean, I'll talk elsewhere about just kind of what toll it took on me. But it was absolutely worth it. Lots of people, as I say, are housed because of the work of Just Us that we never even meet, because the council's temporary accommodation capacity hasn't been increased so drastically. And alongside that, there's been kind of loads of training around kind of good practice, about kind of soft skills, about being nice, about being kind of not making it worse. Which I don't see that really, most councils in the country could replicate that sorts of improvements, which would have knock-on effects in many positive ways. But for me, it's the housing officers who are the key to all of this. If housing officers organised themselves, stood up to it, and kind of were structured in the way they challenged the system, we'd see councils all around the country improve massively. I'm hoping this video is helpful. And as I say, it's not really kind of telling you about intricacies of the law or anything like that, but I think the experiences of people as they go into housing option services and homeless persons units and so on is so negative so much of the time. And it's because the homeless person can feel that injustice. They might not know which section of the Housing Act that is being broken, but they can just feel the injustice of it. And that, I have no doubt, lasts for many years, decades, potentially the rest of their life. There's a really cool guy called Professor Luke Clements who writes a really good book called Clustered Injustice. And he's coined this phrase, systems generated trauma. And I think that's what we're really doing, is we've got these housing option services where somehow nice housing officers end up causing actual trauma to lots and lots of people because they're just following orders. So interested to know what you think about all this stuff. I'm genuinely, I'm not set in my ways. I'm open to learning. So if you've got different viewpoints or kind of other insights, I'd really like to hear them in the comments, genuinely, because I think it's such an important issue, and I want to get kind of better at, being, kind of making sure I'm actually right in what I'm saying and articulating it as best I can. Because my aim is to essentially get to a point where that kind of practice is just seen as unacceptable, and that's that comes from a shift in our perception to it's just the way things are, to actually something can be done about it, and it's really bad what's happening. And as I say, for me, it's the key to ending homelessness. So hopefully that's helpful.